Hello friends, today we're going to be talking about the lunar eclipse occurring on August 28th in the sign of Pisces at 4 degrees. And I would say that this eclipse is asking us to confront something profound, but yet very quiet. And that's because the nodes have already left Virgo-Pisces axis. They're now in Leo and Aquarius. And we have already had its initiation with the previous eclipse on August 12th. So a new 18-and-a-half-year story has begun. And yet we're having these last two eclipses in the sign of Pisces and Virgo, which is telling us there's some unfinished business about the past stories that we're supposed to be leaving behind. And I would say that they're demonstrating something very human in some ways, because life can move before we end up moving. Like something can objectively end in our life, but psychologically we end up living inside of what's ended. And this is because experiences that we have, they're not just things that happen to us. They happen, and after they happen, we organize ourselves around that event and that occurrence. So we end up developing identities around things that we come to experience in this life. We even create adaptation mechanisms, beliefs, and a whole bunch of defense systems. So it's not so simple that something happens and then it's ended and then we move forward. We build a whole world around some occurrences in our life. And that's because we're trying to make sense of it. And again, those occurrences come to their ends, but somehow we're still responding to that old story. So for this reason, I don't think the narrative of this eclipse is so much about what's ending. I would say it's about understanding what has already ended, and yet how we're still organized around it. And this distinction is super important because there's a huge difference between an experience becoming a part of our history and an experience continuing to define who we are and how we proceed in this life. And I'd say this is where the final chapter of this Virgo-Pisces eclipses are taking us. And this is what we're going to focus on today. This is the context of our video. But before moving on, I do want to let you know what's coming up in the next video, which is that square between Saturn in the sign of Aries, debilitated, Mars in the sign of Cancer, debilitated. That's going to be a very fun conversation between these two guys. And I'm going to touch on this aspect during this eclipse too, because they are coming to their perfection and they are having a profound influence on the dialogue that's related to the eclipses. And if you want to catch that upcoming video and a lot more, please do remember to subscribe, press that notification bell so YouTube notifies you when those videos are released. And let's start our video with understanding what this ending is about. And if you think about it, we think of an ending of something when an event ends. But psychologically, an end of something is so much more complicated. And that's because we don't just experience events. We experience an event, then we build a story around that event. We build a story about what happened to us. And if you think about that story, it's telling us who we are, what happened to us, what it meant, and ultimately what we had to become because of it. This is actually one way that we human beings can out-survive certain experiences in this life, especially when they're super intense. We have to make meaning from it. And through that meaning, we come to connect it to different facets of our lives and its timelines and to its different perspectives, people, all kinds of things get connected. But when you think about it, this same psychological structure that helps us metabolize experience can also become a structure that binds us and it prevents us from leaving it and exiting it. Because sometimes when we sit there and we've had an experience with the story attached to it, we're not just remembering the past. If we pay attention, we're continuously organizing the present around some past story. And I think this is what the eclipses are trying to show us here. It's trying to show us how we're remaining loyal to certain identities that were created by certain circumstances of life. The circumstances no longer exist, but somehow the who of who I am around it still does, and this needs to go. So when I talk about the ending of identities, this is what I'm talking about relative to the eclipses right now. And I want us to highlight what this specifically means in the sign of Pisces. And the first thing I want to remind you of is that sign of Pisces is the last sign of the zodiac. And this matters because by the time we arrive to the sign of Pisces, we have traveled through 11 other signs. So the individual self has differentiated itself. It has gone through its developmental process. It has acted, related, struggled, created, lost things, understood things, has just accumulated a lifetime of history now. And when you come to Pisces, Pisces actually asks us a very terrifying question. Pisces is going to say, how much of that history must remain attached to your definition of yourself? Pisces says that everything that you've constructed, everything that has a formulation, that has a form, when it comes to my sign, it needs to dissolve. It needs to become undone. So in the sign of Pisces, we encounter the principle of impermanence. And when you think about it, this is one of the most difficult things for us human beings to grapple with. We achieve, we attain, because we think we're accumulating something that we can hold and have. We have this quality where we develop attachment to things. We want certainty, we want pattern recognition, and we also become very attached to our identities. So when we come into the sign of Pisces and it's saying impermanence, let it go, detach, let it dissolve, it's very difficult to do this. And we're so crazy as human beings because we get attached to some of the most absurd things as well. Like we can develop attachment to who has betrayed us and what has betrayed us in this life. We become attached to the identity of being the one who has always sacrificed, the one who has always been surviving, the one who had to carry everything, the one who never received what they needed from other people in this life. Like if you keep saying these to yourself, I'm that type of a person, this is your identity. And they might be describing something very true about our history, but we have to realize this truth has its parameters, it has its time limitation. It has to expire and end somewhere. Otherwise, it becomes part of who we are and we become the carrier of it throughout time. So it becomes a form of an entrapment. This truth can enclose us in an untruth. This is the self-thinking. I need what happened to me in the past in order to know who I am today. And because I need this, I need to constantly preserve and defend what happened to me, even though if the identification's negative. So now we're coming and we're encountering this difficult component of Pisces that says, let it go, let it dissolve. Pisces asking us for surrender in some ways right now, and the surrender of the previous form, the previous identities. But I do want to say this and acknowledge this. Surrender is rarely ever peaceful or easy. In fact, it can be very frightening, especially if we don't know how to trust in that moment. And I want you to remember the sign of Pisces belongs to Jupiter. It has to do about trust and belief. So if you don't have trust and belief, the act of surrender is experienced as the greatest amount of danger. And surrender here to let that identity dissolve. But I also want us to remember because another form of identity is trying to emerge. Another story wants to come into being. But it can't if we keep preserving the one that has already died and expired. And I also want us to recognize we're not foolish or idiotic for wanting to hold on to those past stories, because that past story and its identity is giving us a positionality in this life. It's allowing us to locate ourselves and to position ourselves. It's giving us a sense of knowing. It's providing a relationship to the world. And we human beings very much need this. So to take that away, sometimes we feel very disoriented, like we're getting lost. But we also have to remember when we're getting lost in the sauce of stories that no longer apply. And another crazy thing is that we need to also recognize how we keep ourselves inside of familiar suffering. Because this can also feel a lot safer than entering that future where we don't know who the self is. We don't know how it's going to be located or positioned. The unknown factor frightens us. But no matter how we feel about it, this eclipse right now wants that surrender, especially with Rahu North Node, which is going to amplify this. This moment, it is about letting go of something. And again, it can feel very disorienting and costly. But I want you to think about this. I want you to reflect. This moment is not coming out of the blue because we've been working with this for the past year and a half when the nodes came into the sign of Pisces and Virgo. For instance, in the past year and a half with Ketu in the sign of Virgo, we were being shown how some systems in our lives, we've outgrown it. No matter what we do, we can't correct it anymore. There's no course correction. There's no way to improve it. So Ketu was showing us time and time again, it's time to actually let go of these routines, these ways of being in the world. Ketu was showing us where correction itself had come to its limit, where the analysis of it was another form of attachment. So Ketu was trying to let us release the analysis itself, that ruminating, thinking about things. And I wanted to think on the other side of the axis, we had Rahu North Node in Pisces, right? And Rahu was keep evoking the same question, which was, what if the next stage is not about some neat, organized way of understanding things? What if the next stage actually requires you to open your hand and to release what was? And you just have to trust where it is that you're going. So if you think about it, both of these axes, Virgo and Pisces, they were promoting this idea of letting go, relinquishing, dissolving, in the sign of Pisces, merging and unifying with something that is without a form. And Ketu was getting rid of the formulations in the sign of Virgo. And there's something poignant happening regarding this process that we've gone through, because as this eclipse is happening, the moon is at 4 degrees, the sun is at 4 degrees, and then Mercury is sitting beside the sun in the sign of Virgo at 5 degrees. So this Mercury in its own sign of Virgo, in its exaltation, is combust and only hours removed from being in a Kazemi position. So Mercury represents the intellect. So we're talking about an intellect, a thinking process that's so loaded right now. It's extraordinarily active. So we might think, I'm having a clear moment of understanding. And because I understand it, this means I have to hold on to it because I feel like I understand it. But I want us to realize we're having an eclipse on the other side of the axis. The moon, which represents the mind, it's being eclipsed. So it's challenging that understanding at the same time. Mercury saying, we can hold on to this. We can finally figure this out. Moon saying, let it go. Let it be. And I think if we can have that moment where that surrender and acceptance happens, the same Mercury can actually help us to understand why we have behaved the way that we have, why other people have behaved the way they have, why we've made particular choices, how circumstances unfolded. And there can be almost like an emotional release. The mind is releasing things. The intellect or thinking process can release things. So we can have a positive manifestation of this too. This could be the intellect that's recognizing finally that I've reached some sort of a threshold with this old story and experience. I've reached a boundary of its usefulness. This is actually Mercury understanding that I can't think my way out of this one. The only path forward here is to actually surrender to that moon, let it go, create some RAM space so something new can come in so that Mercury can work with it. And this lunar eclipse is trying to free us from the grip of something in our past. And we're going to have about 6 months of this letting go process. So this is not something that's going to happen on the 28th and by the 29th, you got to let it go. No, we still have one more eclipse in this Pisces Virgo axis, which is another lunar eclipse, but happening in the sign of Virgo in February. So we have 6 months to work with this, to understand this. And I think the only question right now is that, am I going to step into this as a willing participant, or am I going to clench my fist and fight my way through for the next 6 months to hold on to an old identity, to an old story that has reached its end and its expiration, but I'm just keep pushing it forward. So these are some of the things to consider. And talking about switching gears, I want to switch gears for a minute right now and talk about the nakshatra that's hosting this lunar eclipse. So the moon is in the lunar mansion of Shatabhisha. And before getting into it, I do want to make a disclaimer. I do not want us to conflate the nakshatras with the zodiac, because I'm reading the eclipses through the tropical zodiac while reading the nakshatra through the sidereal stellar framework. I'll put the degrees down, but if you want to convert the tropical to the sidereal, it's about 23.5 degree difference. You can't just look at a tropical zodiac and think it's the same thing as the sidereal one. But going back to our nakshatra, Shatabhisha, I want you to know that the deity of this nakshatra, his name is Varuna. And Varuna adds a very important dimension into our delineation here right now. First thing I want you to know, Varuna is associated with this concept of Rita, which is talking about a kind of a cosmic order. Existence has an inherent order, which is this Rita. So its maintenance and its upkeep, Varuna has a lot to do with this in its narratives. And Varuna was also the original king of gods. He was the original Indra. He's also a god of judgment. He's said to have 100 eyes. This nakshatra is described as having 100 eyes. He also holds a noose, and the noose is meant to catch those who violate this cosmic order, because things need to be kept in a bound, in a boundary that's functional. And if we think about it in this moment, Varuna is asking us to see beyond the single eye of our own history. And that's because when we deeply identify with an experience, we inevitably see reality from inside of that experience. But Varuna's 100 eyes right now, this nakshatra's 100 eyes right now, is asking us to see through a larger field of vision, a field that allows us to see not only what happened to me, but what actually happens. And this is the way to see what belongs to us in the story and where something actually belongs to someone else. It belongs to the story of the world, but we're personalizing it. We're taking on the burden of it. We need to expand our field of vision to understand this. This is what this nakshatra is about right now. And I want you to remember Mercury is on the other side. It's thinking, so it's seeing and it's trying to decipher this. We need to see what we were actually responsible for. Because that judgment right now could be judgment against ourselves. We could be passing very brutal judgments against other people. And that's because we're just looking at it in terms of how I felt. But if we look at the totality of the picture, there's more to the story. So it's important to understand what we're responsible for and what was never our responsibility. We need to see what can still be corrected, because we can't just throw our hands up in the air in reality either. Sometimes we still have responsibilities. We need to correct some things. And other times we can't correct anything. It's just a matter of acceptance now, for better or for worse. And I want you to pay attention here. Varuna's passing judgment by allowing us to see our own judgment and the judgments that we're passing on others. But when it comes to Varuna itself, his judgment right now is not punitive. It's restorative, because it's trying to bring us into proper relation to the dynamic of the story in its larger picture. That's what the noose says, right? Keep things also in the right boundary. It wants to return things back to the rightful place. And the noose, again, is about the act of catching something, bringing it in, putting it in its rightful place. And a lot of times we need to do that with our life stories, with the things that have happened to us, the stories that we constructed for ourselves along the way. Another note about Shatabhisha that's worth talking about, it represents 100 doctors also. So this nakshatra has a lot to do with healing and healers. It's about knowing how to bring different elements like ointments together at a particular space-time relative to a wound, so you know how to heal it. And I would say what Shatabhisha wants to heal right now is not about inducing forgetfulness or giving us this tendency of pretending that things never happened. That's just putting a band-aid on top of something that's infected and it becomes more infected and then we have to amputate it. That's not the point. And it's also not about absolving ourselves from legitimate responsibilities that we should be taking on. But it's about seeing clearly. It's about cleaning that wound. It's about understanding what was never ours to carry and to finally take responsibility for what is ours. And I want us to think about this. Sometimes healing requires correction. Like a bone that's been broken, you got to put it back in the right place, reinforce it so that it heals correctly in alignment. But sometimes healing is about removing something, releasing something. Sometimes to save someone, amputation is the right action. Something needs to be removed. That's the process and the path to healing. And wisdom is always about knowing which path is the right course of action in this moment. And having this nakshatra here, which is about judgment, so it's saying something about discernment. We need to understand this. Where do we stay and correct things? Where is it that it's time to let go of certain things? And again, having Mercury in Virgo exalted, this is what I was saying, that it can help us with some discerning process in this moment too. And Virgo is also related to healing. So this is very much a theme right now during this eclipse. And again, considering that Shatabhisha has to do with healing, the mandate of a doctor is to heal. So the objective here is to heal. The process eventually wants to restore something back to its health and to its proper order. And I think when it comes to us personally, with our own will, with our own consciousness, this is about honing what actually belongs to this phase of life. Take that noose, throw it around what must be in your life right now, not to drag things from the past into your present. It's about releasing what no longer works, things that are making us sick, whether if it's physically or psychologically, emotionally, socially, financially. Look at the axis where Virgo and Pisces are sitting in your chart. It's talking about release of identities and stories in that house, pertaining to the themes of that house and the people of that house. And I want us to understand this from another perspective too, in terms of what's dissolving, what's coming to its end. The conclusion that we're grappling with is not just something that happened in the past 18 and a half months. We actually need to understand the past 18 and a half years of our life, because that's the cycle for Rahu North Node and Ketu South Node. That's how long they take to come back to the same axis. So this is a time for us to also ask ourselves, who was I 18 and a half years ago? Think about what you were learning about that Virgo-Pisces axis of your chart. What lessons were being taught? What was being introduced to you 18 and a half years ago? Think about the responsibilities that came your way, duties that you had to take on, routines of life and habits that started to formulate around that time. Think about how you had this inclination that you have to put yourself at service of something. That's all the Virgo axis. And then when going to the Pisces axis, think about how you were conceptualizing the notion of trust, faith, belief, meaning, merging and unifying with someone else or some other facet of life. In general, what were you trying to put into order? What were you just starting to understand? Something that required 18 and a half years of living. And you had to walk through this path to understand its meaning today. And if you think about it, 18 and a half years is just enough time for an entire identity to be born, to develop, and to come and exhaust itself. And if in doubt, look at human life at 18 and a half years. Our life kind of turns upside down, right? We graduate from high school and dear world, here we come. We need another identity altogether. And we have these increments throughout our entire lifetime. So think about then and what started and how it's come to reach its end. It's reached the end of its usefulness and it cannot carry the previous form forward. And we have to remember these astrological cycles, they just constantly return back. Like Rahu and Ketu will return back to Pisces and Virgo. But we as the chart holders, we as the experiencers and the observers of life, we don't return back as the same person. So the nodes are actually telling us that churning of the ocean is talking about the evolution of our consciousness. 18 and a half years, like flash in a pan, if you think about it, but for human life, quite substantial. Let's assume we live up to 100 years. In 18 and a half years, we should have perspective shifts. We should think of ourselves differently. We should see the world in a different way. Like through the reoccurrence of, let's say, the nodes or any of the planets, we're going to encounter familiar existential themes, but always from another level of consciousness. And I think understanding right now what began and what's coming to its end, it's also a gift in terms of understanding our own developmental process, how conscious we've become, how much wiser we've become. So this is also a process that's much larger than just releasing identities and stories. And this is why I'm not also framing this eclipse as some doom and gloom, some huge Big Bang occurring. This eclipse does not have to be dramatic in that way because the ending that needs to end has already occurred if you pay attention. And I think the proof for that is that this eclipse is happening after the nodes themselves have already shifted signs. So in some ways, the future has already begun. The next set of stories for the next 18 and a half years is already being made. But of course, it seems that the sky is telling us we do have some unfinished business because we have this outer sign eclipse in Pisces, and then we still have another one in the sign of Virgo coming up. And I just want to encourage you right now to just take a minute, kick back, and pay attention to how your circumstances might have changed. They've moved forward, but some part of your identity still remains behind. Or it could be vice versa, which means your identity has actually moved forward. You have new identifications in this life. So you're formulating an identity around it. But for some reason, you keep engaging with worn out circumstances and people that actually don't belong in your future. So pay attention to that. And I think these next two eclipses is where consciousness is actually catching up with reality. This is going to be a time period where we're supposed to finally say, yes, that happened. Yes, it mattered. It changed me. It taught me a whole bunch of things, and it will always belong to my history, to my biography. But who I am now no longer needs to be organized around that. And if you think about it, this is a very different kind of an ending because we're acknowledging the past. We're not trying to brush it under the rug and pretend that it didn't exist. So we're not removing the past. But this is about changing our relationship to the past. And that brilliant, exalted Mercury is very much here to help us in its positive manifestation in that way. And you would think we're going to get to the end of the video right about here, but I do want to bring something to your attention that I mentioned earlier in the video. That difficult conversation between Saturn and Mars as a square during this eclipse. And I think this is describing the discomfort of this transition point. And Saturn's showing us by sitting in a sign after the sign of Pisces, right? So the Pisces sign is saying, let go of the form. Let the form become its potentiality. It is the sign of Aries that ignites that potentiality into existence. And Saturn, like a dam, is just sitting there withholding. It's like it's putting its finger on the keyhole of existence where this potential is supposed to emerge and come into existence. And Saturn's like, no, no. So Saturn's not allowing that new life to become immediately visible. We're having this moment of crisis right now. I understand that my past has ended, but how do I carry myself into the future? So this is a very uncomfortable period with Saturn in general in the sign of Aries relative to Pisces and all of these eclipses, the nodes being there. Right now, it feels like we have very little clarity about what is supposed to come next. And I think Saturn's actually saving our ass by doing this, as much as it's creating opaqueness and hardship, slowness and frustration, because we do have this urge as human beings that as soon as something goes out of our life, we need to replace it with something else. We need to instantly define who we are. We can't sit with that ambiguity for too long. And if you think about it, if we do this, we're just going to recreate the old attachments, the old patterns, the old formulations, which inevitably gives rise to the same forms, which takes us down the same path, which consciousness has already outgrown it. So talk about absolute suffering. Sometimes that little space between identity dissolution and the dissolving of it and the formulation of the next one, that space is needed to remain empty for a while. And I talked about that in one of the previous videos. I'll link it below, which was about the relation of Saturn and its trine into the sign of Leo, and with Ketu being there and with Jupiter being there. And I want us to know that emptiness doesn't mean nothing is happening. It's us giving something room to emerge. First, it needs to breathe, and then it can grow. And Mars is also not letting us emotionally express ourselves and move forward. The actions that we need to perform to solidify this identity are also being hindered by Mars right now. Mars in a water sign debilitated is like taking a fast, deadly, lethal bullet and shooting it underwater. It's like just going through very slow. That's Mars right now. So we can't act this new identity either. So Mars is holding us back, asking us to refrain from actions right now. It's telling us, let something more fundamental come into existence. Don't reinforce the past. This stillness right now is about loosening our grip. It's about not striving, but only to let go. And this is bringing us to the end of our video. And before closing, I would like to ask you to please like, share, and subscribe. And please comment. You guys know I love talking with you guys, and this is the only way for us to connect. And I'd love to know how you're picking up on what it is that's ending in your life. But what is it also about you that still wants to hold on to it? What is that doing for you? How are you still organizing your current life and what could be in the future around some past concept? And I want you to take note of what that is doing to you and your life. Think about what identities you're willing to let go because you don't want to be identified through them anymore. You don't want to identify yourself in that way. You don't want to connect with the world through that identity anymore. And I want you to face that fear emotionally and psychologically. If I was to let go of this identity, if I am not this type of person anymore, who am I? what would happen to me? Do a kind of a mental experiment almost, because sometimes a lot of our fears just exist up here. In reality, when we put it into practice, when we find applications for engagement with life, they're non-applicable. They never come true. So maybe this eclipse is a moment to actually have a little time for contemplation. I'd love to know your experiences. And if you want a reading of this transit, the upcoming transits, or just to understand your birth charts, to understand where you've been, how you've arrived, and how to proceed forward, you can go to my email in the link below this video, or you can go to my website for more information. My email is also there if you want to touch base with me. And now to close. So when I look at this lunar eclipse, I feel that its deepest question is about what are you ready to stop being defined by? Not what are you ready to forget, or what are you ready to pretend that it never mattered to you? Like, I don't care. No, not that. But what about your past that can finally become your history? A history that does not have to remain a part of your identity. When we look at our human history, we have done some crazy fucked up shit, but that is not part of our identity today. If anything, we're striving not to repeat the same things. So we can have something as part of our history, but our identity currently is something different. And I do want us to acknowledge there are experiences in this life that permanently change us. Something about our past can rewrite our future in terms of who we become. So this is not to negate that. And moving forward doesn't mean we negate the losses that might have incurred. We're not negating consequences that are still active in our life. We're not negating the fact that we might have lost people that we feel today that we will love forever, that we made choices that we have to now live with. Pisces and this lunar eclipse is not asking us to just forget about all of that. Wouldn't that be nice? But it's asking us whether the boundary of the self has to be continued, must continue being drawn around it. Do you have to define yourself and your life relative to past experiences? This is what Pisces wants us to surrender and to let go, this lunar eclipse. And if you think about it, maybe this is what it means to conclude the past 18 and a half years. If you think about it, who we are today, where we stand, and how we're trying to exit is not the same person who was entering 18 and a half years ago. So I would encourage you right now to reflect, to use that exalted Mercury in the sign of Virgo, to think about what have you learned in the past 18 and a half years? What has been exhausted in this past 18 and a half years? What has been corrected over and over? You've gone back to it over and over, but no further correction can be implemented. Think about the ways you have already grieved things, because I was saying this ending had already begun. And in some ways, we have already grieved certain losses. And think about how the final lesson right now is about letting the lesson itself come to an end. And I would say that the wisdom of this moment is to allow what happened to become part of who we've been without requiring it to determine who we're becoming. And maybe this is the strangest grace that we're getting right now from the sign of Pisces and this lunar eclipse. And if you think about it, the world and existence saying, I'm already done with something. I have already put the nodes in another sign. The churning of the ocean has already occurred. Time has already moved. Life has already moved. And now your inner life and your sense of self can also move with it. This is almost like a permission that we're getting that we can move forward. And this brings us to the end of our video, and my wish for us is this. May we have the courage to see clearly what belongs to us and what does not, to correct what remains ours to correct, and to accept what cannot be rewritten. I wish for us to allow some of the old definitions of ourselves to finally lose its grip and necessity. Because perhaps the chapter doesn't truly end when the story ends. Perhaps it ends when we no longer need the story to tell us who we were. And that's it for today. Sending you much love. Till next time.